This meeting is being recorded.
All right, well, yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with Joseph to lead a discussion on new techniques and numeric relativity in BNS simulations. In that regard, please interrupt, unmute yourself in case you'd like to interject. I'd like this to be more of a discussion, but there's plenty of material I have prepared in case there aren't as many questions. So hopefully we all understand the motivations behind why we need new techniques. Currently, we're not covering all the bases when it comes to binary neutron star simulation, certainly not accurately enough. It's not a solved problem, very far from it. I think the closest thing to being sort of under control would be the GR solver. And then we go completely onto the other side of things, the neutrino physics, advanced equations of states, and incorporating the latest result from nuclear physics. That's something that I think we can all agree we still have a lot of work to do. GRMHD, we're in almost all numeric relativity simulations of binary neutron stars, we are under resolving the magnetic turbulence. That's a key feature in these mergers proper. And then electromagnetic radiation transport, self-consistent EM radiation, which is, of course, another of the messengers. We don't have it yet. So one way of putting this is the current codes are too inefficient to survey needed binary neutron star parameter space. I think also we need to add the physics, but this is something sort of a separate issue. And if you will, you can think all else being the same, the cost of a simulation goes like the number of grid points. And this is really the essential, gets to the heart of the idea behind the TCAN that brings us all together. And that is, well, this is a fact. Most numeric relativity codes right now use Cartesian AMR grids. They look something like this crudely. You get these discontinuous jumps in resolution as you move out, so that you have high resolution where you need it and low resolution where you don't need such high resolution. And it is rather efficient until you consider better coordinate systems. Let's consider, in that spirit, the most important multi-messenger astrophysics system. That's a black hole accretion disk that we want to model in full 3+1 dimensions. And here we're going to compare a Cartesian AMR versus spherical grids. This is a back of the envelope estimate, and it really is what motivated the work that brought about this TCAN. So consider the path of a fluid element in a black hole accretion disk. So we're looking down, say, at the orbital plane. The resolution, you'll notice, changes by a factor of 1.4 over the path. So if you have a feature in this fluid that is just barely Nyquist resolved at dx resolution, then when it gets over here, it's going to be under resolved. And what that does is it introduces artificial high order multipole modes and when we model black hole accretion disks on Cartesian AMR grids. So we have a factor of 1.4 in efficiency. Basically, we're throwing away this high resolution here for when we get to the low resolution here, when it comes to modeling these, say, sharper features, if you will. But it also applies to smooth features as well. We can also look at this is just in one direction, the polar direction. If we also look at the azimuthal resolution, it's also a factor of 1.4 lower because of the cube nature of the spherical cells, the Cartesian cells. Also, we have these factor of 2 jumps, these discontinuous jumps in radial resolution. And I'm just sort of really throwing a number out here, but I think that would result in something like a factor of 2 in efficiency, where effectively, because you have a very discontinuous jump in resolution from here to here, effectively comparing that to a smooth radial transformation, you could probably do this transition much more smoothly in a radial direction. So there's another factor of 2 roughly. Now consider when we have a fluid flow that is closer to the black hole. Say angular momentum transport causes this fluid element to orbit more closely. Well, we have these sharp AMR corners, you see, where we have a lot of grid points here, and we're moving from a coarse grid. This fluid element is moving from a rather coarse grid to suddenly a very fine grid and back to a coarse grid. So again, any sort of Nyquist resolved feature in this high resolution region will suddenly become under resolved as soon as you get back to the coarse region. And that happens over and over again. So effectively, what you're doing is you're wasting these grid points, about half of these grid points on this high resolution grid. And all I'm doing here is I'm just looking at the ratio of the volume of a cube where you have a sphere exactly fitting inside that cube. So the volume of the cube divided by the volume of the sphere is almost a clean factor of 2. Also, we have a coarse grid underneath the fine grid that's completely unnecessary. Well, unnecessary in the sense that it's not doing anything. Fine grids, wide AMR boundaries. This is something that may be fixable with next generation AMR using discontinuous Galerkin methods, for example. That's about a factor of 1.5 in efficiency. So in summary, basically a Cartesian AMR grid trying to model the most important system for multi-messenger astrophysics. For every 1 grid point you would need in a spherical grid, you need about 15, maybe 10 in next generation. So really, the idea of that Stefan has been advocating for, thinking outside the box, I think is very, very relevant. So we all want to perform our proof of principle simulations. These are in general going to be very expensive. They push our codes and our algorithms to the very limits. And we want to move into the realm of connecting with observations. And doing that is going to require a very strong focus on efficiency. So we can add more physics, so we can span the vast parameter space, and so that others can actually afford using and connecting our codes to theirs. And of course, that requires the extension. I think this is a wonderful thing happening in our field where more and more of us are open sourcing our codes and releasing them with good documentation. And this, I think, is an essential feature to the future of our field so that others can connect their codes with ours. So just some general characteristics. I don't think there's much provocative to say here. We need higher order methods for smooth regions where we're modeling fields that are smooth. Discontinuous Galerkin, we know high order finite difference. We need, again, for in terms of efficiency, both single CPU performance and excellent single CPU performance and GPU capabilities, as well as task-based parallelism to cover the ground of both the diverse and heterogeneous computing architectures that we're going to need to be performing our simulations on, as well as being able to perform the diverse multi-physics that's required to model BNS mergers. We need improved grid structures, as I already mentioned. SPH, of course, is, I think, a great step in the right direction. Non-Cartesian coordinates, and I'll just briefly mention a moving mesh approach that Phil Chang and I have been pushing on. Also, interoperability with other codes. So these together, I think, are a brief overview, brief summary of what is going on right now in the field. And maybe looking even farther to the future, there's some interesting developments going on in the Newtonian world when it comes to AI ML, AI and machine learning. But I think generally the path of our field in numerical relativity has been we are developing our algorithms based on what's been found successful in the Newtonian context. So maybe next generation numerical relativity. So this brings us to the nature of the TCAN itself that sort of sponsors this workshop. And the idea is very simple. We want to perform an in-spiral merger using a sort of general purpose grid structure, this Cartesian AMR, using the code Illinois GMHD, which is in the Einstein toolkit. And then once we have the black hole has formed and with an accretion disk around it, we want to, and the space-time has basically become roughly static, we're going to hand off the data to a code that is custom tailored and custom tuned for for black hole accretion disk simulations in JIRA MHD, HARM 3D. And here I'm going to show a movie just showing that the handoff that we were able to develop over the past couple of years has been successful. So of course, we're looking here in the plane perpendicular to the orbital plane, Illinois GMHD, and it's going to transition to HARM 3D. And you'll notice that that transition was very smooth, and it took a lot of effort to make this happen. And of course, we performed multiple handoffs at multiple times to ensure that, in fact, the space-time, the results were invariant. we have some confidence that the results are invariant to when we handed it off, so long as it's past a certain time. Here's the magnetic field amplitude. Same simulation. And watch closely. The grids will disappear right at the time where the handoff is. And you can see it's a very smooth transition. We see strong evidence of magnetic turbulence here. We are resolving MRI. And again, the idea here is with the improved efficiency that we gain from migrating to a spherical coordinate evolution, we can then perform the much longer term evolutions much more accurately than we would have been able to, and much more cheaply than what we would have been able to with a Cartesian AMR grid setup. So a couple of lessons I've learned for the multi-messenger area. Diversity numerical techniques is essential because we're all using different approximations, different formalisms, and the diversity of these techniques is essential to understanding our systematic sources of uncertainty and thus building confidence in our predictions when we find overlapping qualitative agreement. Diversity in physics, of course, means that having a code that's interoperable with other codes is optimal. So we don't have to write a numerical relativity code that tries to do everything, which is generally not a good idea, both in terms of personal expertise nor code expertise. So one idea that I've been pursuing with Phil Chang, and it relates rather well with Stefan's talk and the previous talk, Stefan's talk, is this notion of merging a numerical relativity code with a code that has been designed to do Newtonian hydrodynamics to make it do general relativistic hydrodynamics. Here we're using my black holes at home code, which uses highly efficient grids. The idea here is numerical relativity is going to be the cheap part, and we're going to couple it with the moving mesh Voronoi code, MANGA, which has been used to study some of the most challenging problems in all of computational astrophysics, common envelope evolution and tidal disruptions. And it already has a lot of nice features, advanced equations of state, radiation, and hydrodynamics, and we're working on GR hydrodynamics. So some pros and cons. It's superior to Eulerian in that it has far better advection, and given the same number of grid points, you're going to have superior conservation momentum and angular momentum compared to Eulerian schemes. It has favorable characteristics in terms of shock capturing compared to SPH. However, it's a lot more complex. Basically, you need to add both SPH, notions of SPH and Eulerian and computational geometry. You have to think about the grid on top of everything else. Generally, it's, in quotes, slower. It also has continuously varying resolution, similar to SPH. No factor of 2 or 4 jumps as an AMR, or I should say SPH, or say a spherical coordinate system for a nearly axisymmetric scenario. MHD has some limits. It's either divergence cleaning or vector potential based. We don't have a staggered CT scheme yet. And the fact is it may be overkill for many problems. So we've demonstrated the stable evolution of a TOV star with a static background spacetime involving just the equations of GR hydrodynamics on a moving mesh. And we found that good convergence, and we're working on adding that to adding these capabilities to black holes at home and with an evolved spacetime metric. So we've seen some early successes with that, and we hope that the next step is very close. So next, I just asked Joseph to tell us a little bit about a project whose the participants in this project, there's a very strong Venn diagram overlap between those participants and the participants who are leading the TCAN effort. So go ahead, Joseph.
Thank you, Zach. As Zach was mentioning, spherical coordinates or general curvilinear coordinates might be more, could be ideal for many of the problems that we're interested in. Of course, everything comes with a cost, and spherical coordinates, as everyone knows, comes with the cost of, you don't get uniform resolution where you want it. You're forced to get higher resolution at the pole and at the origin, and that could be that could lead to a source of inefficiencies. We've developed this code. Vasily was the lead author, called Spherical NR, which solves GRMHD in spherical coordinates right now, although we're generalizing it to general curvilinear coordinates. And basically, It's built on top of the Einstein toolkit, and it uses the code. There's a lot of it uses automatic code generation. It's pretty agnostic as to what the evolution scheme is. CCZ4 is what we use right now, and it's uses the non-staggered A field. And we're interested, and also generalized. When I say spherical coordinates, I mean generalized, allowing for distortions in both R and basically, we're testing now, or we're considering now, distortions of the angles as well. Now, as I was saying, that one of the big drawbacks of spherical coordinates is the fact that dt is proportional to essentially grid spacing cubed in general. So it's pretty, so it'd be inefficient in that way. And Zach, could you go to the next slide? In the way that we've handled this is basically we look at the CFL unstable modes, and we essentially add a suppression factor so that the net amplitude, the net amplification of the CFL unstable modes is actually less than 1. So in other words, that we basically reduce the make them stable rather than unstable. And there's a lot of challenges associated with this when it comes to efficiency. So it's pretty well. It took us a long time to get it to work. Vasily, basically, it took a long time to get this to work. But essentially, once you have the working algorithm, it's relatively simple to describe. Essentially, you're doing what's effectively a 2D FFT, modifying some of the modes and reversing the FFT. But you have to do that in a way which is efficient. In a fully parallel environment. And our postdoc here, Li Weiji, actually is the one who developed the parallel the parallel algorithm. And yeah, there still are challenges associated with this, because you've basically reduced some computational cost. You've reduced computational costs on the grid, but you've increased computational cost outside the grid, but in doing these FFTs. So I should say computational cost, communication cost is probably more a better description of where this cost is. Can you go to the next slide? So this algorithm does work, and here's some snapshots of an older simulation. Li Wei is currently working on a newer simulation, but basically showing the evolution of a bar mode unstable neutron star, and just showing some snapshots. And you can basically see the expected features of this star, where you start with a symmetric object, develop the bar mode instability, and then eventually you end up with a symmetric object in the end. And so I guess what I would say is that it looks like these look like promising methods. Certainly in cases when you have some kind of symmetry, where these grids becomes are adapted to the problem itself, but they do have challenges that we need to address, and there's cost on all sides. I think that's all that I want to say just about spherical NR itself. And I would like to open up the floor for both questions about this, and also for more general discussion about some of the other techniques that we've been hearing about today and yesterday.
All right, very nice. Yeah, I guess people can just unmute themselves and start discussing things. I'd also be interested to hear more about what people think the way forward is. Yeah.
Can I ask about this Voronoi isolation code? Say, I think many things are moving a bit in the same direction. Say, my new Newtonian SPH stuff uses a couple of methods from finite volume, but in the end, it's still something which you although it's pretty different from the original one, but you probably would still call it SPH. But another thing that you could do is that you formulate a finite volume method on particles, like it has been done many times in a Newtonian context. Did you think about that? Because probably this is conceptually easier than doing your Voronoi cells.
Yeah, Phil, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, so finite volume methods have been done for particles. I'm not sure like if conceptual simplicity is always a great thing to get. All right. So there's a few reasons why doing it in a Voronoi way is a little better. All right. I'll try to explain in Newtonian context. Right. So so the one I'm familiar with basically that does the finite volume is the code Gizmo. I believe that's something you refer to. All right.
There are 20 years earlier, there are already methods which
that's
were
right.
the finite volume methods.
It goes way back, right? Yeah. So I mean, all these L methods are really old, right? But like they've only really been popular in the last decade or so, at least in astrophysics.
Yeah.
So the one thing that can happen, all right, and this is something that's less familiar to me, but usually what happens is that a lot of these things are adopted from SPH, right? And what a lot of codes do, they tend to do at least, is that they say, at least in the astrophysics codes, they usually take a number of neighbors, like usually 64, all right? So Stefan was really surprised when you 300, but that's actually probably a better thing to do, is to have more neighbors rather than fewer. But usually a lot of these codes use 64 neighbors and stuff like that, all right? And then they basically try to construct these like fuzzy boundaries around them and stuff, right? But the funny thing about them that can happen is that a neighbor of one thing may not be the neighbor of some other cell, because you have 64 fixed neighbors, right? And so what can happen in that case is that it can violate Newton's third law, all right? Now, statistically, this should just cancel out at the end, okay? But it doesn't cancel out on a per particle basis. And the nice thing about Voronoi cells is that because the Voronoi tessellation is always unique, that every neighbor, all your neighbors is also a neighbor of yourself, okay? In that case, basically, you can guarantee the Newtonian conservation of Newton's, basically no violation of Newton's third law on a per particle basis, right? So that's basically part of the reason why, like I started doing these Voronoi cells as well. The second reason, partially why, is that you can solve a lot of flux conserved equations on the Voronoi cell. Not all of them are good choices, though, right? But you can do it, right? And so other equations you could put in basically include the equations for Maxwell's equations, for instance, radiation. We've done a lot of that stuff already, all right? And of course, basically like everything else, it's not always great choices, but you can do it at least, all right? And it's nice to basically solve as much as you can on one grid as possible, okay? Now, that being said, basically for the GR version of the Voronoi code, we're actually using two separate grids, one grid for the space-time and one grid, basically one unstructured grid for the particles, but that's just the way it is.
Can I ask about also about the Voronoi stuff? Because you said, in a sense, you may be violating with these finite volume particle methods. You may be violating momentum conservation, but can you, for example, enforce angular momentum conservation in a Voronoi mesh?
Yeah, because they do it on a pairs-wise basis, right? So it's guaranteed to be pairwise.
But the forces, don't they need to be pointing exactly in the direction of the center of mass of your Voronoi cell? Otherwise,
no, you're doing it on it's a finite volume method. So all you care about is what happens to the faces. So the forces that are exerted on one face is exactly equal and opposite of the force on the other face. So that by definition has to be true.
Well, I agree. I think the momentum conservation, I believe that you can do that. But angular momentum, since your cells may have all kind of shapes.
Yes, so right. So that was always been a criticism of Eulerian grid-based methods, because then you have special directions. Now, yeah, you're right. Okay, in that case, it's harder to do angular momentum conservation in that context, because there are directions like normal to the cell faces. All right, but even in that case, I think, yeah, so even in that case, but the nice thing about the Voronoi cells is that statistically it works out in that case. So unfortunately, like there's always some issue there, right? So statistically it works out because there's no special direction, unlike Eulerian Cartesian grids, for instance.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I have a question about Francois. Is Francois here? About just a question about the load balancing that you mentioned earlier today. How do you achieve that load balancing?
In spec for the neutrinos?
Yeah, when you're specifically referring to the Monte Carlo.
Yeah, right. Yeah. The way we currently do it is that the particles are initially, you need to communicate back with the fluid. They are coupled to the fluid grade, right? And so they kind of we start from the fluids distribution of processes, and then each fluid, each subdomain can send some of its neutrino packets to other processes that have a lighter load in terms of neutrinos, but the information about neutrino matter interactions that's centralized back onto that what the processor owning the fluid. So it's kind of a one-to-many communication for each fluid subdomain is the way we are doing it right now, and we are trying to do the communication so that as few grid cells as possible are offloaded to other processors. So we try to offload cells that have a lot of packets, so that we limit the amount of communication, which is proportional to the number of cells and not the number of packets. That's how we do it.
Okay.
But I think there are other ways to do this as well. I think a code that might that is built from the ground up, including Monte Carlo, might also the cost of the hydro and the neutrino together and divide that onto different processes and do that adaptively over time. That's way too much work in spec, which is not built at all that way, and did not take into account Monte Carlo in its construction.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, Wolfgang.
Yeah, so I note that this whole discussion is focused on evolution, but I think initial data is also very problematic in the whole GR field. I mean, it's already very annoying to just set up a rotating neutron star. I mean, there's RNS, there's Lorraine, and both of these codes are not exactly user-friendly or always converge. And with binaries, it's getting even worse. There's all kinds of secret tweaks to Lorraine to make it work and so on. So my impression is that it's not so much the numerical methods that are missing, but like the infrastructure in terms of a good implementation. I don't know what other people think about this. Also, setting up hypermassive neutron star models with more realistic rotation profiles, or something that isn't even axisymmetric but has some sort of helical killing vector, would be, I think, very important because one cannot always make a full merger simulation just to investigate something about the hypermassive neutron star phase. So that's just a point I want to raise for discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Wolfgang. Yeah, as I was going through the slides, I realized that we were completely leaving out the the initial data story. Not that it's a solved problem. I feel like it's relatively in a better shape than the evolution sector, which made me feel a little bit better about leaving it out. But you're absolutely right. Trying to run Lorraine is a bit of a dark art, and we've all had to learn our special spells to get it to generate good initial data for us. But yeah, there's a lot of really, I have to say, there's a lot of really exciting developments that have taken place in just the last few years with initial data in terms of more open source initial data codes, which I find amazing, as well as initial data codes that are just now becoming open source. I mean, in the next year, I think there are going to be at least 2 major initial data codes that are going to be open sourced, according to my readings from last week's Einstein Toolkit workshop. It looks like, yeah, we're in a much better state than we used to be, especially when it comes to the mixed binary, but also binary neutron stars with arbitrary spin. So yeah, I almost wish that we had our own day for just initial data, to be honest.
Yeah, that's good news. In particular, adding spin is a bit of a approximation, and there are only a few codes which can do it exactly, and they are not open source. And then there's also the question how to add precision. It's even worse.
True. Yes, or prescribed eccentricity, or yeah, it can be challenging. But yeah, Svi, you have your hand raised.
Yes, it's about the same issue, because on one hand, what I recall is that in our group in TCAN, there were a lot of questions concerning the use of Lorraine, and my discussions with other people say that there are also problems. They also encountered some difficulties. So is this common, or what is, you gave the impression that everything is fine. This is not my impression from just listening to many discussions on this topic.
No, I thought I said using Lorraine is a bit of a dark art. So one has to put up with a code that can be very finicky, and it can take multiple attempts if one wants to generate, for example, unequal mass ratio binary neutron star initial data. And as far as I'm aware, Lorraine doesn't support spinning neutron star initial data with, neutron stars with prescribed spins. So no, I think with Lorraine, there are many issues that remain. There are some new codes out there that, like I believe it's spelled FUKA, the Fuka code. That's not open source. Am I wrong in remembering this?
I think it is open source now.
Yes, I think so, right? And it's a very interesting new development. If I remember right, it's not as efficient as Lorraine. Like, one needs to run it on a cluster, which, pros and cons. But as I understand it, isn't Fuka based on Kadath, which is sort of the successor to Lorraine? Is that right?
I believe so.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and so where Lorraine sort of did one step for efficiency and then did a separate step, Fuka, I think, tries to do everything sort of in unison. That's sort of my, not everything, but it tries to combine multiple steps. And in doing so, I think it's been argued that it's more robust and may be a worthy successor to Lorraine's throne. But I mean, time will tell. I mean, it does have perhaps robustness going for it and extended features and capabilities, but it also sounds like it's quite expensive to generate initial data. Maybe that's not a big deal. You know, maybe the what we should be doing as a field is sort of dividing in, as we have in the past, into areas of expertise. You know, we have folks who just generate catalogs of initial data, folks who work on evolution codes and adding more physics to them, and folks who work on adding more realism to the initial data and initial data codes. But I think numerical relativity has always sort of been a field where we need to combine expertise, diverse sets of expertise. And there's not been, there's no one that's an expert in everything. And that's probably a healthy thing.
Well, my impression as far as efficiency, that the amount of time spent on listed, for me, just listening to the problems with Lorraine is that it is extremely inefficient in the bottom line. Maybe it's running fast, but the bottom line is extremely inefficient, and we must find something better.
I mean, it can be run on a workstation. I mean, that has something going for it there. It's largely a product of when it was developed, when computers weren't quite as fast. And generally, initial data didn't traditionally need to be run on HPC systems on multiple nodes, but or at least that was preferred, to not have to do that. But yeah, I mean, I think my understanding is the Fuka code is less computationally efficient, but perhaps more robust is my impression. Yeah, again, I wish we had a full day that we could just discuss initial data.
So if sorry, if I can ask here, I guess initial data, I don't know how much it is for binary neutron stars, but on the black holes front, right, the cost of the initial data is basically zero compared to the evolution. And so why not, especially if we want to have large catalogs of like tens of thousands of waveforms, wouldn't we want to favor robustness in general? Because, well, for us, one of the things, you know, if we're generating, say, a new surrogate and we want to run 4,000 waveforms, the thing that is really most expensive is the human time involved in having to tune parameters. You know, there's whatever 10% of the runs don't just work. That, at least to me personally, I would rather give up a little bit of efficiency and just get the right answer out rather than having to tune a bunch of things. I don't know if that's been discussed at all or brought up.
Yeah, no, I hope I don't sound like I'm trying to advocate for Lorraine or any one particular code. I mean, I think the general concept that I would like to propose is all of the above. We want something that's both efficient and robust. Maybe we can't have both, but indeed, I agree with you. I think I'd prefer robustness over efficiency, especially if one considers the human cost, because yeah, you're absolutely right. Probably 90% of attempts at generating Lorraine initial data in my experience have not been successful. But one learns, and then one is capable of generating initial data. So
yeah, and so I guess, yeah, for me, the big thing, I personally haven't used Lorraine, but you know, with spec and stuff, we also of course have similar struggles. Is yeah, like especially for students and stuff, that's I think usually the least fun part of the job, is trying to understand the cryptic internal error messages and this kind of a thing. And I think that's
yes.
Yeah.
Manuela?
Yeah, so you mentioned with apples with apples comparisons for BNS, and this has been extremely successful in the black hole community to make progress to put more or less all the codes into a similar, I would say, ground base. But there is a lot of work to do in the GRMHD community. So how do you think, and whether you think this is feasible, and whether there is interest in this community to start from simple problems to go in the directions of starting to compare these codes that are supposed to deliver accuracy and efficiency for these complex problems. So I would like to call for the community present today to comment on that and what you think about that, whether it's valuable or whether we should be continuing, to write independent codes and work our best to solve problems, or whether there is value to really start doing some comparisons to establish a better ground for these numerical techniques and choices.
Yeah, so just the background, I added a couple of ideas to the list of things we might want to discuss. One is, as Manuela said, an apples with apples test for BNS. Maybe I should have said for numerical relativity codes that have all the features needed for accurate simulations of binary neutron stars, at least faithful simulations, faithful to the underlying physics and self-consistent. I think by and large that when a code paper is released, we have sort of unofficially looked at previous code papers where a number of code tests are performed, shock tube tests for GRMHD, etc. And we try and redo those with our own code bases. But having a standard set would be, I think, quite useful, especially sets that I would say extending beyond the original apples with apples tests and thinking more along the lines of, well, what might fail with this particular numerical approach? What might fail with that? Or what might be suboptimal with this numerical approach? That would be useful, I think. For example, modeling a black hole accretion disk where there's an AMR box sitting in the middle or something like that. Modeling, I mean, these are, or a shock tube going across a refinement boundary. These are really tough tests, and they expose possible sources of systematic error. And sort of being the brutally honest scientists we should all strive to be, it would be useful to sort of come up with stress tests in addition to just apples with apples on, say, a uniform mesh or a uniform moving mesh, a uniform SPH grid. Yeah, go ahead, Nils, sorry.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's, necessary both on the simple test and the more complicated test. And one thing that I think would be helpful on this front would be having the same initial data in the evolutions, right? Because sometimes there's like, oh, we set this up with some random noise. And while it might be like, okay, this is used to trigger an MRI or something like that, it would probably be helpful to have specific data files stored somewhere.
Right.
I don't yet have the authority to say that we will have space, but for example, like we can host them, for example, and that then we come up with, let's say, as part of Spectre or whatever, we add basically code that just allows interpolating the data in a way that we've sort of agreed upon works reasonably well between the different codes. And so that the data can be read and be as faithful to each individual code as possible. And I think this is, it's definitely something I'm interested in and I think is worth pursuing. And this is even a challenge for us in terms of like binary black hole runs, where the junk radiation between different resolutions of initial data is sufficiently different that you can stop seeing convergence or these kinds of things. And of course, convergence with hydro is a different situation, but I think trying to start with a similar or ideally identical initial conditions is worth doing, even if it means storing large H5 files with code that handles the interpolation between different grids.
Yeah, so what about, for example, a missing link run for a BNS? And, you know, I think we can go back to the simple test that Zach was mentioning, but I think we need something a little bit more like a TOV and a BNS, a simple BNS with polytropic equation of state. And let's say we take away the magnetic fields at the first step, and then we compare the various code accuracy and efficiencies, including, I would say, the post-merger phase where people do and how we do in the TCAN this handoff procedure. Yeah. I think it would be really valuable to start doing something, at this basic level, and then we can add complexity.
Yeah.
So I would like to see some interest in the community among the various, collaborations to do this. And I'm glad that I'm hearing that you're saying it, you would be interested.
Yeah, and I think one way forward with this is probably trying to say, okay, hosting very high resolution initial data, if it's numerical initial data, to basically try to eliminate any artifacts from interpolation in initial data as much as possible, right? And
that is correct, yes, which we saw happening, and those are the ones that have been plaguing us.
Right, yeah, and so I think, we should we should have the space to host this. That's not a problem, I think, Mara. And,
yeah.
And then basically, we just have insanely high resolution so that any interpolation is basically not going to be the issue. And have an interpolation code that also doesn't interpolate across the surface of the star and tries to do, the sort of reasonably fancy things just to ensure that the code start with consistent data. So.
Yeah, so Lorenzo Inaggi, who's connected here, who's my grace, started to do some comparisons among these two codes. I'm not sure how high resolution her is initial data right now for the missing link, but that could be a start. I mean, where he can right now he has started to compare things between IGM and another code, Spritz, but it would be really nice if we can extend this and get a little bit of a sense of how we do with the various techniques. So Lorenzo, you may want to comment something about this.
Yeah, hello everyone. I don't quite remember how high was the spectral resolution in Lorraine. I'm just trying to find the data. But anyways, what I was doing was comparing, as Manuela said, IGM with Spritz, keeping the parameter files as similar as possible, and all the sorry, Zach. Yeah, when I say IGM, it's Illinois GRMHD. And I was saying, keeping the two parameter file as similar as possible. So in particular, trying to use the same conservative to primitive scheme, HLLE for the fluxes, PPM for the reconstruction in both cases. And I'm finding keeping the resolution obviously, and the grid structure is the same. What I found was a difference in the velocity of the spiral in the two codes. So this was a bit worrisome. I think we agreed in the end that this was due to probably larger truncation errors in Spritz, and so because of that, Spritz was losing a little bit of mass probably, and so it was spiraling a little bit slower. Now what I'm trying to do is to do the same test at higher resolution to see if the results converge to the same, to the same results as you crank up the resolution. So I currently have one high resolution, let's say, run with Illinois GRMHD, And I'm still trying to run a very high resolution run with Spritz. And I'm facing some problems. RAM for some reason is crashing, but I'm hoping, to have the results soon, so we can really see, if as you crank up the resolution, you get the same results in the two codes, or if really maybe some, numerical choices affect the results, even if the resolution is very high.
Might I suggest a pragmatic approach here? There is a Slack channel, and if you could share some of the, the parameters that you're using for your simulation on the Slack channel, maybe there could be some follow-up discussions about these comparisons. Would people find it interesting?
Sure. I mean, I can share the parameter files.
So if you haven't joined the Slack channel, I can share the link again here and in the workshop list. Please do so. I think it would be really good to be able to communicate this way.
Mm-hmm.
So since there's silence, may I comment on something? I think one problem is also that there aren't any standardized data formats to exchange stuff. For example, there is no data format for example, BNS initial data. So if you use Lorraine, you use Lorraine data format, and then you need the data reader, and someone else might use, I don't know, SGRID initial data, and it's the code that evolves it then uses that format and so on. There is a gazillion different equation of state file formats. Even the units are typically not communicated, so they differ all in the 4 digits because different values of G or baryon mass are used. Metadata is in generally like an afterthought that is scattered all over the place. So I've started a little bit to address some of this with a library called Reprimand, which has an EOS framework and a conservative to primitive scheme, and now it also has a TOV solver. And of course, this is just a one-man effort currently, so nevertheless, I just wanted to quickly advertise that. But I think in this respect, we need more infrastructure. The problem is that it's a really ungrateful task, so it's not like you can easily publish a paper on it.
But we did that for binary black holes, and there were papers published as part of the, I can't remember what it called, Ninja 1, Ninja 2, whatever it was called in the Apples to Apples community. I think it can be done, and I don't think we need to. I think most of these things are things that we do anyway. So if we decide to start with something that people do anyway and agree on repeating some of this tests and comparing some of the results. I mean, people are doing it also for the Event Horizon telescope paper. I think we this community should get a little bit more encouragement.
Well, I'm not saying nothing is done. I'm saying it's not really systematic. So these data formats, they pop up because someone codes something to solve a specific task, and then this is forever settled in stone. And there's not like general spirit of making stuff modular and exchangeable. So this is just not a big change I propose. It's more like a sort of way of thinking to have problems that are not just paper-based, but really more like as modularized as possible and as generic as possible. So if I would write a BNS initial data code, the first thing I would design a data format for this that is completely independent of how this initial data is actually solved. Things like that. It's just a basically way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly encourage all of you to continue this discussion, in particular on the comparison, the Slack channel. I think if we could start going in, in that direction, even starting small and incomplete would be something better than nothing. By the way, gauging the interest of people about this, I'm receiving a lot of people joining the Slack channel now. So there's definitely interesting in into this comparison project. So please keep joining the Slack. Okay, Joseph, Zach, we have still 4 minutes. Any other?
Well, it looks like Vasily has a question or a statement.
Yes, a question rather. Something completely orthogonal to the discussion so far. I guess my question is, what would people, if I don't know, if you could tell NSF what the next machine they should build should be? I guess what would people want in terms of hardware and machines and software environments and all that? Is that something where the community is thinking actively ahead to kind of not make demands, I guess, but at least make the needs of the community known, or is it more a question of we try to be as versatile as possible and basically take whatever pops up on the landscape?
This is Eric Schnetter. It's always very difficult to install software on HPC systems. And there are certain ways to make that easier. For example, CMake, Meson, Spec, Easy Build, and so on. It would be nice if there was some kind of community standard that NSF would push for such a standard. And then we could all make our codes installable via that way. And then it would be easier to install other software and use other people's software.
That is going in the same direction of starting to have the community talking a little bit better about these standards, not just initial data codes, but also pragmatic stuff like that.
I would really like to see clear documentation for singularity support. So we use Term++, and so it's usually we would do MPI builds, but there's usually, like one paragraph on here's MPI, and then there's like 15 pages on GPUs. And it's like, okay, sure, maybe GPUs are harder to run through containers, but that usually doesn't mean that the MPI documentation is sufficient. And to me, this would be a nice sort of way of dealing with the software issue where we can basically use our own stack, except for the communication layers that are tuned to the hardware. And this seems to be some slow movement in this direction, but getting it to work in practice is not really yet great, has been our experience. And so I think, even all hardware aside, that's, I think, one of the big things.
What do you think would be needed in order to get that started? Do you think that if we were to organize a series of specific workshop tailored to start, a discussion about community tools and possible comparisons would be useful?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, this is so both Spectre and Spec have singularity containers already, and most people nowadays who develop either on a local system will just use Docker or Singularity instead of trying to install all the dependencies. And I think getting that support on supercomputers, so we have it on our private cluster, but we, you know, we're sort of, our hands are a little bit more tied on the NSF and DOE machines. And so from their end, that would be really nice.
So maybe the way to go, Vasilio, since you asked this question, would be to go back to the NSF and propose to, and they really like to start with this workshop ideas, you know, and propose to organize something that start a discussion about, you know, precisely providing those common tools for running on large supercomputers, the next generation ones, but also how do we compare data sets? How do we improve the codes? Which codes are performing better than the other, and how we determine that? So I think it could be something, if anyone is willing to undertake this, would be really valuable for this community.
Yeah, and then I guess that Vasilios, to answer the question on hardware, I have not seen convincing evidence that large systems of equations like the Einstein equations plus shear MHD work well on GPUs. And talking with some folks from NVIDIA, they were also very hesitant to be like, oh yeah, that'll definitely work, just because it's such a different beast than the more Newtonian hydrodynamics problems that they're used to. So I think without sort of a group putting in a lot of effort to explore if this is even really feasible, right now I think, you know, CPUs really are the sort of safest bet, and even that is a challenge in terms of, you know, vectorization, as I'm sure Eric can attest to as well.
I'm smiling. Thank you.
Good. So that's sort of, you know, a big challenge on our front. I don't know, Vasilios, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to steer a bit of discussion now that I'm working more on the with the player that provides those heterogeneous systems, right? And I guess it's just lots of resources to have, and I'm not sure if I mean, as you said, it could well be that it's not the prime application, and that you might think out of the box, as we've heard with SPH today, to be able to access those systems. But I guess there's an opportunity there that that should be at least be considered. And yeah, I haven't followed all the new Carpet X development too closely, but from what I've seen so far last week at the ETK workshop, that all looks really exciting, and might definitely be a step forward. I guess yeah, it might be a question that you need that basic infrastructure, and then that model of the ETK where you have a really mature framework that provides you with all the stuff that, as Wolfgang was saying earlier, might not be the sexiest or shiniest stuff to work on, right? Because I mean, as a postdoc, for instance, you might not working on infrastructure, or, I don't know, checkpointing and restarting might not get you your next job. But I guess with Einstein Toolkit, if you have a mature framework like that, then you could focus on, yeah, put in a BSSN solver there and then make sure that runs efficiently and all that. So I'm excited to see where that goes. Maybe Eric has more comments on that, and then yeah, I agree. We'll have to see what if we need other methods and in that direction. But I just think that, I mean, at least the heterogeneous part is there for now, and it might not go away for the next couple of years or the next iterations of big machines. And I guess it's something to think about as a community.
Vasilios et al., I have those of you who were at the Einstein Toolkit, a lot of people here were not attending it. Maybe we can conclude about, is there any takeaway message about this GPU question? You know, you're saying you saw great improvements, but can you mention what are those improvements in terms of efficiency and for what kind of test? This might be problem dependent. So what kind of tasks and problems have been tested so far in that environment?
I would say these days, GPU programming is not much more complicated than CPU programming. If you do CUDA programming directly, that's quite low level, but many packages that provide efficient support for MPI also have support for CUDA or the CUDA equivalents from AMD or from Intel. Now, something that one absolutely has to do is profile the code. If you just write the code and say, yeah, it looks efficient, I think it runs good, that's not good enough. But the profilers these days are really easy to use. You don't have to recompile your code or anything. You just run the code with the profiler, and how to do that should be described by the HPC system. And then you get output that is graphical and rather easy to understand. It points you to the routine that is slow. It says what is slow. Are you not using the GPU efficiently? Is it copying data between main memory and the GPU, or are you waiting for MPI? Now, of course, this is all not trivial, but many of the good HPC centers have tutorials and courses, and they are recorded. So you do have to put some effort into it, but it's definitely worthwhile checking out the tools. And the landscape is much better than it was 10 years ago. I think it's ready to do GPU computing more widely. I think we're ready.
So is there any specific test you guys are going to be running so we can learn a little bit more, let's say, in the context of this community? And I'm going a little bit over time, but I think that's an important subject, I think, so that we can communicate back to the community. Well, if you use GPU, this is much more efficient for this particular problem, like the BNS problem, for example, a vanilla case of the BNS problem.
That would be nice. No, we are not there yet in the Einstein Toolkit, but we are working it. Well, you are paying some of the people who are working on it.
Yes.
And I think once you have something cool, we'll definitely hold workshops where we not just show how to use that particular Einstein Toolkit piece, but teach others about the tools. And in the meantime, I recommend going to a one-day workshop for an HPC center where you learn some of the basics or learn to use these tools. It's if you know a bit of C++ or Fortran programming, then it's definitely within reach for you.
Okay, so Vasilios, I think we are over time. But again, let me encourage all of you to join Slack and maybe to continue this discussion about that. And maybe we can also include GPU as part of the comparisons, and for maybe a vanilla BNS case like the missing link or a TOV or something. So Vasilios, you close.
Okay, all right. Sorry for throwing that in at the last minute. All right, so thanks everyone